Hello again, and welcome back to a very special episode of An Aesthetic Education. In the heart of London, around the corner from the British Museum, just on Russell Square, in fact, lies a very special library, which is dedicated to the important mission of Holocaust research and commemoration. The Wiener Holocaust Library began when Alfred Wiener started to chronicle the rise of Nazism immediately after the end of the First World War. Throughout the 20s and 30s, Wiener's work served as one of the earliest warning signs about the dangers of Nazism and the oncoming Holocaust. Now, 100 years later, the library continues to serve as an important cornerstone in Holocaust studies and research through their collection of artifacts, their library, their exhibitions, and much, much more. Today, we are privileged to welcome Dr. Toby Simpson, the director of the Wiener Holocaust Library, to discuss these very important topics, along with the library's history and why it is such an important and special place in a world that is facing a stark and frankly scary rise of anti-Semitism. Toby, thank you for joining us on Aesthetic Education. This is a monumentally exciting moment. We have had many guests, but they've all been from the art world. And to have somebody with your historical background from an institution that's so fascinating and important, and it might be different from our normal programming, but I know for a fact that our listeners will be very interested to hear what you have to say about the Wiener Library and hopefully then pay you a visit when they eventually come to London as well. So if you could just sort of give us a brief overview about the history of the library, how it started, where it came from, and sort of where it is at this point in our kind of crazy modern world.
Yeah.
That would be great.
Thank you, Jeremy. It's really wonderful to be here talking to you about the library. I've been working at the library for 12 years now, and I still remember my experience walking in to the library and seeing the archive. And for the listeners, it's the world's oldest Holocaust archive. It's actually been running continuously as an organization right the way back to 1933, which is when its founder, Alfred Wiener, was forced to leave Germany. And he took with him a great deal of evidence he'd already pulled together on the Nazi regime and how it worked. So how did this German Jewish man have the idea of creating a library to expose to the world what the Nazis were doing? How did that come to be? That's a longer story. And that's the story that I've come to understand in depth, having worked at the library for such a long time now. But perhaps we'll come back to the deeper story of how it came into being. I remember very vividly, though, the power of the archive that is now based in London. It's the largest collection of material about the Nazis in the whole of Britain, and it's one of the most important sets of evidence of the Holocaust anywhere in the world. And what does it contain? It contains diaries, letters, photographs especially. And really, I'm talking about a lot of material. There are 40,000 photographs in the stores. And it captures even that very, very extensive collection captures just a fragment, just a small part of the history of the Holocaust, this catastrophe for the Jews of Europe. And it's very moving. It's a place which still is visited often by survivors. And that's also been one of the privileges of working there, meeting the people who built the place. So that's what makes it special.
When you think about the courage that it took for a man like Alfred Wiener to begin that sort of chronicling of Nazism at such an early stage in the history of the Nazi movement, which obviously eventually led to the creation of the library. What do you think was possibly one of the biggest driving factors? Because most people following the First World War were not really aware or frankly interested in this small group of people, mostly based in Bavaria, who seemed to be causing all sorts of problems.
I think he had a really strong sense of civic responsibility. He was patriotic. So he was born in a small town called Benchen, which is now in Poland. And he was kind of brought up with conservative German values. His father was a small businessman, but sort of had standing in the community. And at first, Alfred Wiener, he was a smart guy. He thought about training to become a rabbi. But I think as his life progressed, he became more and more interested in the civic side of Judaism, and also the struggles that Jewish Germans had getting recognized as full citizens. And so he was already becoming aware of prejudice against Jews, the problem of anti-Semitism in Germany. And he joined an organization that did a lot of really important work to represent Jews in Germany. But even the name of the organization is quite interesting. It was called the Central Association for Germans of Jewish Faith. So they very much put the German front and center.
Yes.
And he, before the First World War, already was involved in B'nai B'rith, which is an organization which had a global presence, but in Germany was very much concerned with social action and with helping with poverty among Jews living in Germany. So although he was an intellectual, and although he had a very strong understanding of anti-Semitism, he also was concerned with social action. So after the First World War, fighting for his country, he was shocked, even though he understood anti-Semitism in Germany, he was shocked by how it intensified, how the Jews were scapegoated, especially by extremists on the left, but especially on the extreme right.
Yeah. It's one of those things that I find, I've looked at the book, the one that contains his two major pieces of writing from those early days, that the library published. And I find it really interesting to sort of denote his mindset, because, as you say, the library now contains thousands and thousands of different types of artifacts, everything from newspaper clippings to photographs and everything else. And so the foresight that was needed to begin sort of rationalizing that into an action of, we're going to actually chronicle what we're seeing in front of us, even as we maybe try and stop it, but unlikely that it might work at that point, because you could sort of see how quickly things were, getting out of control. And I find that really interesting because it became a library, right? This idea actually became a physical embodiment of that civic duty that you talked about.
That's right. And that didn't happen kind of in a straight line. He started out warning about right-wing anti-Semitism in general, but then he did understand sooner than others how dangerous Hitler was.
Right.
And he was one of the first, for example, to write a critique of Mein Kampf. And he was so disturbed by some of the most virulently anti-Semitic passages in Mein Kampf that he really tried to foreground those for people. That started a monitoring of the Nazi Party in particular. And he also then later, even before the Nazis became a mass movement, started working with a man called Walter Gissling, who wasn't Jewish. They had different ideas. They worked for the same organization. Walter Gissling felt that the way to fight the Nazis was to adopt some of the new modern techniques of propaganda, invert Nazi slogans, use kind of graphic posters with sort of bold colors. So, for example, there was the famous Nazi anti-Semitic slogan, "The Jews are our misfortune." And Walter Gissling made stickers, which we still have in our archive, which said the Nazis are our misfortune, and kind of had a caricature of Hitler's face. And, it probably worked to some extent.
Sure.
But what Alfred Wiener believed was that rational argument, speaking in public, telling people the facts, that was the method that he wanted to pursue to try and stop the Nazis. And he did a ton of work. So, for example, in the 1932 elections in Germany, him and colleagues distributed 100,000 leaflets, which really deconstructed all of the anti-Semitic slanders and gave people facts about Jews serving the Kaiser in the First World War, of falling for the fatherland. He also gave lectures across Germany. He kind of went on a lecture tour. Now, all of that work required a kind of resource base of information.
Yeah.
So he could only overturn Nazi misinformation if he had good information of his own. That's how the library started, because it was kind of their own private library. But increasingly, other people wanted to use it to also join the struggle against Nazism. So it didn't start as a library, but it quickly became one.
Yeah. And I think when we, these things, when they happen sort of by osmosis, so to speak, and this natural reoccurrence, it's when they've sort of latched onto something that has meaning.
Yes.
And so thinking about that and just kind of, seeing that, how Wiener eventually took that to the UK, following his own traumas of having to leave Germany, go to Amsterdam, spend time there, so on and so forth, leaving his family behind essentially at one stage. The UK has become a home now for that collection, which is in many ways both appropriate as being the one major country in Europe that did not have Nazi rule, and also at the same time strange. It's just an oddity of history, right? So thinking just in terms of some of the artifacts and things that you have in the collection, what are some of the things that you might say, like obviously you mentioned the stickers and things like that, but that are just very unique that you can't find anywhere else?
Yeah. It's not always things that you would expect. So you're right about it being in a way just chance that this collection ended up in London. That's true. And there are certain other collections that have the same kind of path. So one of our most extraordinary items is a set of diaries that give an incredibly detailed description of prisoner life in Terezin, in Theresienstadt.
Yeah.
And they are a miraculous survival in and of themselves. The person who wrote them, a German Jew called Philip Mannes, he was from Berlin, and he had no personal connection to Britain at all. But he didn't survive. His relatives did, and he was able to hide these diaries in his bunk, eventually in Theresienstadt.
Sure.
And although he and his wife tragically were deported and murdered in Auschwitz, the diaries got out via his bunkmate and were given to a relative who had got out to Britain.
Yeah.
And it just so happens that the reason that's part of the reason they were in Britain, but that family also became aware of the library, partly because of other prisoners of Theresienstadt who had been in contact with Alfred Wiener. Leo Beck was famously imprisoned in Theresienstadt, and there was another survivor of Theresienstadt, Hargey Adler, who was one of the first to write a history of Theresienstadt camp as a survivor of the camp. And so that network was connected to London also because the Czech government in exile was based in London. So these disparate strands of history, as Wiener's library, as he created it, it became almost a magnet for Jewish refugees, and they built a culture that most German Jewish refugees based in London knew of the library, not only because of the historical resources it contained, but because it became almost a world of its own where refugees and survivors could meet and talk and find people who understood what they'd gone through.
Yeah. It's one of those things that we as people who've come 2 generations removed, obviously, at least from these events, it's very difficult for us to understand, even if we know the history, to find that sort of connection that they had. And as you said, the sort of randomness of history that led to certain people having things and somehow made it out is really always fascinating. And having been to Theresienstadt a couple of times, I always found it interesting how much actually survived from that camp. Obviously it was one of those places where actually culture did survive in very strong forms. But for them to make it all the way to the UK is very profound in a lot of different ways. And so my next sort of question relating to that is, with this collection, because it is, so unique and truly, I think outside of Yad Vashem, probably one of the best collections related to Holocaust artifacts around. How do you sort of envision, as the director, the use of this stuff nowadays in order to both commemorate, the Holocaust, but also at the same time to help research, to help academics continue, Holocaust studies, and because there's obviously still so much left to learn about and to try and understand.
Yes. Well, I've always admired, especially the fortitude of the people who built the library, including Wiener, but also many others. And I think this salvaging, this protection of the evidence is something they understood was very important. And you talked about Alfred Wiener's foresight. I think he had a real foresight about the threat of the Nazis and the destruction that they could unleash. But I think he also had foresight about the value of evidence. And we don't always know, we can't predict necessarily the way that this material will be used. And that's still the case. But what we are facing today is a resurgence of anti-Semitism, which I certainly never expected to see with such virulence in my lifetime. It's very concerning. And misinformation is a huge part of that. There clearly are those who are hardcore anti-Semites who deny the Holocaust, and they unfortunately, as a result of social media and the dark web, are able to connect with other like-minded people far more easily than used to be the case. There's also, I think, a lot of ignorance, people who either only understand the very basics or don't understand anything at all about the Holocaust, and certainly about Jewish life. And I think that the power of the library and the role of the library is to provide that solid bedrock of evidence that is, and in a strange way, the physical material has become even more important as digital distortion has become simpler. You cannot argue with a huge archive of physical documentation, which is essentially what the library is. So, and there are others in Germany and in Yad Vashem, as you say. So part of it is that bedrock of evidence, but you have to put it to use. You have to educate, inform, and that is a collective task. There's no one institution or one person who really can provide the silver bullet, but we can challenge ignorance if we work together. And so the library is very energetic in partnership work, not only in Britain, but also, so for example, with organizations that work with teachers in schools, who work with, for example, Jewish societies on campus, which is a big challenge at the moment. We're very conscious that we need to work as part of a wider effort to challenge ignorance.
I think, thinking about the exhibitions that you obviously hold at the library to, sort of show just some of the artifacts, but also most importantly, put the artifacts into a context for people to understand. And I wrote this down because I wanted to make sure I got it correct. Because it's obviously not just about the Holocaust. This year you've had an exhibition on the Armenian and Yazidi women. telling their stories,
Mm,
which is fascinating.
mm,
And then obviously, I think right now the current exhibition is about the Library of Lost Books,
mm,
right, which talks about the Higher Institute of Jewish Studies in Berlin.
mm.
So when you think about that and you think about sort of putting together these exhibitions, because putting together any sort of, big piece of work is obviously complicated, and we want to make sure that people understand what they're looking at within a context, but also leaving them room to sort of discover these ideas for themselves in a way.
Yeah.
So what's sort of the process that the library goes through when they consider what they're going to be putting out for exhibition, and how they're, just to speak to what you're saying about aiming to sort of work within that network of, institutions and communities to best put out the truth about the Holocaust or genocide or whatever it might be.
Yeah, we do consider our exhibition program carefully, and in the case of more recent exhibitions, we've had particular aims. So you mentioned about the Library of Lost Books, and one of the things that we wanted to do there was to ask people to get involved. And what happened with the Higher Institute of Jewish Studies in Berlin was that the SS essentially looted the library, and the books were dispersed, and some of them have been recovered, but not all. And what we've been asking the public to do is to get involved in searching for the remaining lost books. And we've had a great response to that. So we have found that if we ask people to actively participate in exhibitions, it creates a different level of engagement. Um, with the exhibition about Yazidi women and Armenian women, one of the things that we wanted to do was to highlight the fact that tragically, people are still being targeted and murdered just for who they are today on racial grounds, and we also wanted to give voice to women's experiences, put them on the record, um, and also bring in new audiences who may not understand that there are organizations like the library which are actively recording and putting on the record evidence of people's experience of genocide. So we did find, actually, we analyze often our audiences for exhibitions, and we did find that for the exhibition about Armenian Yazidi women, we had more people coming to the library for that exhibition that had never been to the library before, which was great to see. And so we try to be creative, maybe push the boundaries a little bit, and do things that go beyond what people expect us to do. And I think we have great curators who are constantly coming up with new ideas of how to use our collections. So please do visit our website, wienerholocaustlibrary.org, because we have several online exhibitions there. Increasingly, our exhibitions have a digital element, and actually are an opportunity for us to digitize material too. So whenever we research an exhibition, we often are bringing out things from our collections that we haven't even realized we have. It's such a huge collection.
Of course.
Even after having worked at the library for 12 years, I'm still discovering we have stuff that's incredible. And every time we do that, we try to showcase it.
As a brief segue, just because you just mentioned it, and then we'll get back onto the next topic. But what you've been at the library for 12 years. What brought you to the library in your own sort of academic journey?
Yes. So I studied with a historian called Professor Richard Evans, who was well known for the role he played in the David Irving trial, because he was the expert witness. And for those listeners who might not know, David Irving um, was exposed as a pseudo historian, and through his Holocaust denial. But he attempted to claim against Deborah Lipstadt, who's an excellent historian and now the US representative for fighting anti-Semitism with the US government. He tried to claim that she was libeling him by calling him a Holocaust denier. And it really had to be shown meticulously in court that he had distorted documents mistranslated, constructed a false narrative. And I was very inspired by the almost surgical, thorough exposition of my supervisor in essentially taking apart this guy's arguments. And it reminded me of the importance of history, of facts, gathering evidence, because that trial really did, sadly, at the time, there were still those who were even quite people who were otherwise respectable historians who tried to sort of be sympathetic to David Irving, and it was really only by thoroughly showing he was a fraud that Holocaust denial was exposed for what it was. And as a student of history, I was very inspired by that, and I still am, because sadly, there's still a need to reinforce. Even though Holocaust denial, I think, is more marginalized than it was at the time of the David Irving trial, thankfully, we can't be complacent. And so it was really that which inspired me to begin specializing in Holocaust history.
And so that's what brought you to the library down the line.
Yes. And in fact, Richard Evans had known the library and was on the academic advisory board of the library. I visited the library in the course of my PhD. And it had just moved to its new premises at the point when I graduated from my PhD, which is fortuitous because they were recruiting.
Yeah. It's a great location. For those who don't know, it's on Russell Square. So right around the corner from the British Museum. Very convenient, right in the heart of Bloomsbury, near all the publishing houses, and also obviously near University College London. So very convenient for those who do want to visit at some point. I find it fascinating just sort of how people find themselves to these types of places, especially for the Holocaust related things, because it's such a difficult topic. And most people in some way, even if they're aware of it, probably prefer not to really deal with it or think about it. And I think what you said before about how, for example, the Yazidi women or the Armenian women exhibition brought in a whole slew of new faces to the library, which is wonderful and exactly what you're hoping for. But does that not also kind of say that maybe they see Wiener Holocaust Library and, I don't know, they get a little scared almost in some ways? You're sort of, as a resource, you're battling against also the subject matter, which is difficult.
Yes, that's true. And I think that even though it is the case that it's a difficult subject, and it's emotionally it's very upsetting to confront it head on. I nevertheless think that most people are interested. Perhaps they wouldn't necessarily have the confidence to step into a museum or archive, which is partly why we've needed to make such efforts to reach out and be accessible and not just be an archive behind closed doors. I do think, though, that actually every thinking person needs to engage with the Holocaust, because it is such a disturbing reflection on humanity, who we are as human beings, and it did happen, and we know this. And for me, I've never encountered someone who has actually said to me, I'm not interested in it. I have encountered people who are maybe nervous about it, feel they don't understand enough to fully engage with it. But one of the things that makes it really clear for me and my colleagues that we're doing important work is that actually people do want to learn. On the whole, almost everybody does want to learn about the subject.
Do you think that the role that the collection can play now, moving towards, as we talked about briefly before, the current environment on university campuses, both in the sense of the hostility that Jewish students are experiencing, but also Jewish faculty are experiencing, and at the same time, maybe the lack of presence of Holocaust studies and Holocaust curriculum
Mm,
within the university framework.
mm,
This is a constant battle right now, and it's something that we've talked about briefly beforehand. But well, first of all, where do you see that at this moment,
mm.
right? That sort of situation, and what do you think the library can hopefully provide as a um, antidote, so to speak, to that? I don't want to call it a toxic poison, but in some senses it is.
Mm. Yes. One of the things that I've definitely noticed is a sort of gross insensitivity to uh, mm, to anti-Semitism, which means that I think the current climate on university campuses is deeply unpleasant for Jewish students, and we experience some of that because we're right around the corner from an occupation, for example, at the School of Oriental and
Yep.
African Studies. Um, we also had some graffiti on our sign, which was really unpleasant to feel sort of targeted
Mm.
in that way. For those you might not have seen, the listeners might not have seen the story, the news story, but we had the word Gaza graffitied on our sign, which said the Wiener Holocaust Library, in this red paint, and it's I think grossly, essentially that was an anti-Semitic attack, sort of targeting us. But I think in addition to that, it exposes an ignorance about how offensive it is, how clear it is that this sort of graphic use of red paint and the blood libel. There's so much about those connotations that the people who are perpetrating those most heinous acts, those most aggressive acts, generally, I think, probably are perfectly aware.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of people who are simply ignorant,
Yeah.
and that compounds the problem in a way,
Yeah.
because there's a blindness to just how aggressive and how offensive it is. And so that's been difficult for us to deal with. But at the same time, in terms of our role, actually bringing some of that awareness to people, we have decided that part of our role is to educate about anti-Semitism. And you can't really understand anti-Semitism without learning about the Holocaust, which isn't to say that learning about the Holocaust teaches you everything you need to
No.
know about anti-Semitism. But we certainly have a role to play. And unfortunately, it is often necessary simply to teach people the basics. What is an anti-Semitic trope and why? Um, and certainly it's the case that we have a great deal of material at the library to illustrate that powerfully.
Speaking as a former educator, obviously, when I would teach about the Holocaust, I would begin with Jewish history,
Hmm.
because I always felt that you could not possibly think or even attempt to understand the Holocaust if you looked at it as if it just happened in a vacuum and it just appeared out of nowhere and everybody was positively shocked that something like this could have occurred when we had a 2,000-year history of building up of anti-Semitism in so many different forms, be it religious anti-Semitism all the way to racial anti-Semitism to whatever form that might be. Um, do you feel, in a way, speaking almost as a historian in this sense, that a lack of basic historical knowledge sort of leads towards not only ignorance, but a tendency into those anti Semitic tropes in some form?
Yes, at least to a degree. I think that history is good history is enlightening. It helps people understand the world they live in. And I think one of the aspects of anti-Semitism is that it really feeds on emotion and irrationality and sort of lashing out or finding a scapegoat. And I also think that um, one of the benefits of learning about Jewish history is the ability to strengthen our civic society.
Mhm.
And I think it's especially important in Europe and the United States, um, given the the nature of Jewish history in those polities, like whether it's in Western and Central Europe, or whether it's in the United States, these were, in a sense, where mass political anti-Semitism first gained strength. And I think for us, uh, living in America or living in Britain as we do, um, strengthening those institutions that have helped people of different religions or completely different ethnicities or backgrounds live together successfully with strong institutions and a sense of, enlightenment, rational discourse. Strengthening those things, I think, genuinely is important, because anti-Semitism thrives on kind of the opposite of that, on kind of anger, hatred, and irrational uh, theories of sort of conspiracies, or whatever the case may be. Um, I don't want to make it sound easier than it is. I mean, anti-Semitism is the longest hatred, and it never really goes away. And I'm thinking again of Alfred Wiener and his experience fighting anti-Semitism with everything he had. Uh, he wasn't able to prevent Hitler coming to power, and um, I think it was a personal tragedy, a deep personal tragedy for him. Not only because his wife, he lost his wife, who essentially um, uh, succumbed to the murderous conditions of Bergen-Belsen. Um, it was an insurmountable tragedy to him, but nevertheless he did not give up. And I think we have to take inspiration from that, because there was also a triumph. Hitler was defeated, and we have managed to build strong democracies, but they're at risk again.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. One of the things that I find interesting, I suppose, is the fact that um, an institution like the library can exist, and yet it's not just that anti-Semitism has always existed, which we know it always will in some form, but the fact that, as you even just mentioned before, that by being a beacon, so to speak, of truth and historical knowledge and this sort of archive, this commemoration, this act of remembrance, right, of what happened, you also then become a beacon to modern day anti-Semites, be it through the graffitiing or whatever it is. And just thinking, and I know that a lot of listeners will be wondering about this, but obviously since October 7th, we've seen a huge uptick in anti-Semitic incidents in the US, in the UK, across the globe. And so how does the library sort of, it's not your job to, so to speak, combat that in a, political sense necessarily, but how does the library sort of, position itself at that stage when what you've been talking about and what you've commemorated is all of a sudden now not just on the periphery of society, but actually front and center?
That's a challenging question. I think actually organizations commemorating the Holocaust are still adjusting to the world after October the 7th. And I think it is very important to express our solidarity with Jewish communities everywhere. And I also think that we are going to continue to face a challenge from the ever evolving social media landscape. From the abuse of the term genocide as well, I think is a major issue which we're going to have to grapple with, because it seems clearer and clearer that people are failing to challenge the use of the word genocide in essentially anti-Semitic forms, almost a form of blood libel, where the victims of genocide are being inverted into perpetrators, and it's often done incredibly thoughtlessly, like in a sort of 3-second TikTok, and I think that we have to ask ourselves questions as a society whether we need to make some fundamental changes in our culture if something as serious as that is being discussed in ways that actually fuel the problem and it increase the kind of anger, irrational hatred that I was talking about a second ago, which exposes us at even greater risk of violence, and Jews especially at greater risk of violence. So I think that's something we all need to be very concerned about.
It's one of those things where you see it happening in real time, and it's like watching a car crash because you know how it's going to end. And obviously working within that collection and working within that world of Holocaust studies, you ultimately understand where these things can lead to.
Yes.
And that perhaps is the most terrifying thought of the whole thing. But I do I want us to end on a slightly more positive, note, and also just to sort of expand what the library does do as well, which is you have an active program to assist people, family members, things like that, to not only research what happened to their own family, but also in claims of restitution, citizenship claims, things like that. So can you talk a little bit about what that sort of looks like from the library's perspective?
Yeah, that's one of our most proud activities. And I think it does speak to what we were saying before, because my view is that through being a beacon in a positive way and through strengthening civic life, that is one of the values of libraries, our library. And I think that's especially powerful in the context of the Holocaust, because these are experiences which profoundly affected people and their descendants. So we still actually do help survivors who are trying to understand more about what happened to their own families, or indeed sometimes their own experiences. And we've been able to be present at such incredibly moving moments as, for example, showing people um, uh, the last piece of handwriting of relatives who they were separated from as children. And I really, thinking of back to the memory of those kinds of occasions makes me feel very emotional myself, because um, there, there is an act of, there are possibilities of restoration and repair, even though you cannot make up for the loss. Those small acts do help profoundly with people moving forward, people feeling a sense of release, feeling a sense of connection as well. And that is something that we're very proud of. And it makes for a wonderful counterpoint to some of the necessary work we have to do, uh, um, not only educating people about what happened, but also warning people about the dangers of of something similar happening again. To be able to engage in some of those really moving acts of repair gives you more of an optimistic sense of progress, of the power of humanity.
Yeah, it's a wonderful thought. I know from my own research and experience as it relates to art restitution, how valuable the library is, and having talked to many professionals who've worked in that area, how often they've come to use the library for that as well, which I always find both heartwarming to hear and um, you know optimistic, that in the sense that certain injustices, at least in some form, as you said, can be still even corrected a little bit all these years later. But it's a really it's a wonderful thing, and one that is both vitally important and too often overlooked in some ways, because it's not as front and center in the public consciousness, maybe in the same way as what it once was.
Mm.
But I think that that's a wonderful point.
Yeah, it's genuinely a privilege to work at the library. And I think that it's in a way a gift to all of us. It's a legacy of the survivors, of those who resisted, and in a sense, those who perished as well, because they're part of the story, and remembering them is part of what we do. And I think our duty as a generation is to make the most of that legacy.
It's a wonderful thought and a wonderful way to end. But thank you, Toby. I will be linking all of the library's websites and various things in the description of this show. I encourage all of our listeners to please take a look at the library's website. If you are in London, please go and see the exhibitions. You can go sit in the library, and it's open to the public, which is a wonderful, rare resource that those who are not in London maybe do not have the privilege of seeing on a regular basis. But London is full of such amazing public institutions, and that is a reason enough to go spend some time there at some point. But truly, thank you for coming onto the show and talking about this important topic and the wonderful institution that is the Wiener Holocaust Library.
Thank you, Jeremy. It's been a pleasure.
I want to give a very special thanks to Toby and the Wiener Holocaust Library for agreeing to appear on this episode of An Aesthetic Education. The work that the library does, not only as a place for academics, for research, but their exhibitions, their interactions with the public, their collection itself that they protect and care for with so much effort and personal touch. It truly is a special place that is very fortunate to have special people working at it. So I would encourage all of our listeners to take a look at the library's website. The link can be found in the description of this episode, and spend a little time exploring to see what the library has to offer. And if you do ever happen to be in London or you're fortunate enough to live there, please go and check it out. It is a truly special, amazing place, and one that will continue to go from strength to strength and do wonderful and important work around the subject of Holocaust commemoration for many, many years to come. So thank you very much for listening. This has been Altalena, and we'll see you again real soon. Bye-bye.